you still remain.
Master, the book is speaking.
I did not write this.
What does it want from us?
If you seek to be heard,
This is no duty, but witness.
The ledger of last words. The ledger was heavier than its size suggested, a thing born of ritual and gravity. Bound in cracked leather darkened by ink and old blood, it lay upon the oak table at the far end of the executioner's cottage like a small altar. The pages inside had yellowed unevenly, some were seamed with soot and others had a soft, damp translucence where long, closed tears had settled. For decades Allard had treated the book with a careful, almost liturgical patience. He made the ink himself each morning from soot and tannin, boiled in a pewter pot until the mixture darkened to the color of old rope. He sharpened a quill until it whispered across the paper, and for every name there was a manner, a careful pause, a measured breath, the tilt of chin before final words were recorded. Duty required it, tradition demanded it, memory demanded it. Allard had begun his role under a simple assumption: there is order in names. A name written was a life admitted, a debt accounted for. He became the repository of last statements, of curses and prayers, of confessions and refusals. He was not a man of sentiment. Broad-shouldered and stocky, his weathered skin drawn taut over knuckles that had learned rope and iron, he moved with the economy of someone whose survival had been measured in small repetitive motions, the tightening of a knot, the setting of a block, the turning of a page. His hair, salt and pepper and kept close to the scalp, spoke of practicality more than vanity. A thin vertical scar punctuated his left cheek like a punctuation mark, and his brow was furrowed by 100 quiet reckonings. He spoke rarely and recorded forever. The village that clustered at the foot of the gallows hill had learned to give him space. Children dared each other to retrieve dropped coins near his doorway. Women hurried their laundry past his yard, and men averted fearful eyes while carrying grain. They treated Allard as a tool of function and necessary darkness that kept order on market days and allowed harvests to continue. Some prayed for him, some cursed him. Very few considered the ledger. That responsibility remained within the cottage, where the wind found its way through the single mullioned window and lifted dust motes into columns of light that smelled of candle wax and damp straw. From outside the house seemed prosaic: a smoke-streaked roof, a low door, a yard cluttered with coils of rope and lengths of chain. Inside, the air always carried the peculiar odors of ink and boiled tannin, of wet wool, and the faint metallic tang that clung to Allard's hands like a memory. Mariel had arrived as an apprentice because the trade carried wages, and because she had a practical mind. She had come from the next valley with a bundle of linen and a small chest of utensils. She had little family and none of the large hopes that make people stay where they are beaten down. Her fingers were often stained with ink, and the chalk stub at her belt told of her counting and recounting names for Tali. She watched Allard with curiosity that walked the narrow line between reverence and fear. She understood the physicality of the work: the coil of rope, the iron key on a worn thong, the heavy leather apron. But she was not prepared for the ledger's weight on the air. At first she assumed her mentor's silence was simple taciturnity. Over months she learned the rituals, the way Allard rested his thumb on the ledger's edge before he wrote, the way he paused to listen when a breeze sighed through the eaves, the small rubbing of temple, when a particular name returned like a bad scent. The book contained 300 last words, but it also held patterns. There were the prayer's short, tidy invocations shaped by habit: Lord, receives scrawled in a blunt hand a child's halting Hail Mary, a trembling father's plea for mercy. There were the confessions, fulsome and messy, sometimes practical, a confession of theft, an admission of an illicit pregnancy hidden in tonight, sometimes monstrous, the recounting of cruelty done for coin or under the convulsions of a panic. There were curses long and flung with rage, directed at judges, at family, at the sky. There were sentences that were neither prayer nor censure, but rather mundane notes that nonetheless carried a human weight, someone's precise instructions for where to bury a child. A landlord's account of unpaid dues, a mother's few last names of kin to be watched after. Allard wrote them all with the same steady hand, as if equalizing balances on a ledger of sin and debt. In the early years, the book was a ledger in the bone sense, a record, a thing to be closed and put away. But over time the entries began to press like a second skin. Names overlapped with dates. Some pages gained a faint halo when breath and damp did their work during execution nights. The ink darkened like dried blood. Allard began to feel that he had not merely recorded their words, he had invited something to remain. The village's children became elements in the margins, scribble marks, games played with sticks against the oak of the cottage door. Birds nested in the eaves, and sometimes the wind would turn a page, revealing a line of a name, a half-sentence, and then a silence like a cut breath. He kept precise habits. Before dawn he would light the first candle and set the pewter pot on the hearth to warm. He would make the ink slow, coaxing the black from soot like a ritual libation. The quill had to be right, not too blunt to smear, not too sharp to tear. He learnt which paper welcomed certain words and which rejected them. He kept a small tin where he scraped off unusable shavings and the grit of his work. The tin's contents resembled the accretion of a life lived with its hands. He kept the ledger on the table in the same place, at the same angle, as if a new position might break the chain of voices. Allard tried, for a long time, to keep the ledger formal. He catalogued, he counted. He would step out onto the hill at sunset to observe the silhouettes, to note weather for the record, a dry wind, a sky clear as glass, a rain that slicked the ropes and made them almost impossible to hold. The ritual of writing became a scaffold for his conscience. He gave each condemned person the same small courtesy, a moment to choose, a last posture to register, a deliberate mark where their name would sit, indented, on a line like a tally. Those who asked for absolution received the same ink stroke as those who spat curses. The ledger did not judge it held. That idea comforted him, even as it wore at the edges of his peace. The change began gradually, like a bruise emerging beneath the skin. One autumn night, after a procession of 3 executions and a frost that had turned the gallows hill hard as bone, Allard closed the ledger and left it open on the table. He wrapped his hands around a mug of watered oil and listened to the wind. A sound came through the thin panes, a low, layered singing that seemed not to belong wholly to the outside. It was a chorus of fragments, an echo of vowels and the scraping consonants of names. Allard thought at first it was the wind pressing against old mortar, caught in the angle of the roof. He rose, annoyed at his own superstition, and returned to his chair. It happened again the next night. The wind unsettled a page, and where ink had sat there formed the afterimage of a voice, as soft, layered, not quite speech. Mariel, fetching a quill, heard it too, a murmur that gathered, and then thinned like breath being drawn from a throat. The two of them stood in the doorway and listened, while the candle tilted under a draught that did not seem to be. There were words, but not words meant for the living. Instead, they were the shifting timber of memory. The chorus repeated names, it hummed dates. It bent sound into patterns that suggested both accusation and entreaty. The book had become a mouth. Allard answered this first with disbelief, and then with a form of stoic observation. He recorded more carefully, as if by sharpening the ritual he could keep the phenomenon within the bounds of explanation. He took extra pains to blot a line clean, to rub a smear with the back of his hand, until his skin glowed white at the knuckles and his palms hurt. He made a second, secret ledger smaller, where he transcribed impressions rather than words, the way a surgeon might draw the tremor of a hand, but not name the disease. He would, in the smallest hours, write in that book the texture and timbre of what he heard, a rasp like straw, a thin soprano that never settled, a laughter like chafed twine. Mariel watched him at work, the set of his shoulders, the way he drew breath in small, even increments. She wondered if what they heard was a piling on of guilt, some communal echo that the living created from memory. The chorus, when it gathered, behaved like weather. It could be rude and abrupt, a single name snapped out, a hard consonant that left the table vibrating. It could be mournful, a layering of vowels that washed the room like rain. Once on a winter night, when the snow under the window banked high, the chorus sang a child's lullaby out of a handful of names, and it sounded for an instant like forgiveness. The voices were not human in the sense that they had individual faces. They were a mass, a gathering of last intonations bound by the ledger's spine. In their presence, the wood of the cottage seemed to hold its breath. The candle flame bent inward. Mariel's role shifted from apprentice of rope to apprentice of listening. She learned to turn pages not with haste, but with reverence. She learned which inks caught the chorus, and which left only silence, soot ink that sat on the surface and paler tannin that seemed to soak in. She learned to fold the corner of a page as one might mark a hymn. Sometimes she would wake before dawn, and find the book open on a page she had not herself handled, and a single, soft line of sound in the room, as if someone had walked through and whispered into the grain of the table. Allard never called the phenomenon by name. He only listened, and when the chorus swelled and a particular cadence repeated, he would close the ledger and run a thumb along the spine as if closing a wound. They began to notice subtler things. Certain words, when spoken in the final moments, left a taste on the air. Water became a coldness that pooled near the hearth. Mother set the panes to sweating as if a warm breath pressed against them. Some names drew images with them, not in ink but in the senses, the clink of a coin, the smell of roasted onion, the scrape of a child's shoeless feet. Allard recorded these in the margins with symbols, a loop for laughter, a small bar for weeping, a cross for anything that threatened to veer into blasphemy. Over time his shorthand grew into a private language, an attempt to fix the chorus images so they might be read later without listening. He suspected, privately, that the ledger had borrowed a different faculty, that it no longer only kept speech, but had learned to hold impressions. The town's magistrate visited once, sent by a curious and petty nobility who thought to use the ledger as an instrument. He wanted records and he wanted witness. He thought that the book might help convict men of crimes by tracing their last words. He did not stay long. He did not hear the chorus. In the daylight the ledger was simply a book. In daylight the world is generous with its denials. By the time he left, his list of questions had become smaller and then invisible. The magistrate's last request, whether the book could be inventoried and copied for the county, was laughed off by Allard with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Tradition, he said, required that some things remain singular. The magistrate, unused to being refused, had demanded a legal reason. It is not in our charter, Allard said. And besides, some tools are only proper in their hands. The magistrate, without wanting to risk public superstition, let the argument hang and took his leave. As months turned to sevens and seasons stacked, the ledger's chorus did not merely repeat names. It began to form a melody of its own. It learned to swell behind the rhythm of a thrummed table, to bend consonants into soft, time harmonies that felt less like accusation and more like compendium. The house would fill with a layered vocal mass that made breath feel thick and difficult. When the chorus rose fully, neighbors thought a storm was near. The wind on the hill answered like a bell. People saw the light in Allard's window and crossed themselves as if expecting a visitation of ill omen. This change did not go unnoticed by Allard. He felt something shift beneath the muscles of his chest. Duty became a heavier thing. He found himself pausing on the path up to the gallows, hand on the rope, chest tight. He catalogued with more and more detail the tilt of a head, child-s size, the clasp of a hand, a garter's color. He began to ask a condemned person without words, to perform for the record a small habitual gesture so that the ledger might carry the last movement as well as the last sentence. He did not expect his subject to comply. The choreographer in him wanted a closing posture, someone's fingers arranged like a benediction, a head turned to the west toward a remembered field. He recorded these in the margins like a cartographer marking a coastline, a shorthand that meant more to him than any public list. When the chorus began to sing as if in answer to certain names, Allard discovered another thing: some entries refused to be quiet. Certain names would linger in the room long after the candle guttered. Allard would wake in the morning to find a page turned and a line circled in a hand that was not his. A child's rhyme would resurface, inked faintly into the gutter in the same curve as a human mouth. He would find his quill damp without cause. At times he suspected Muriel, and at times he suspected that it was simply damp air and his own tired eyes. He took to locking the ledger away in a chest with an iron key, only to find the chest unlatched the next morning and a wind-streaked page exposed like a pale wing. The ledger did not bring immediate madness. It brought small ruptures, a pause where Allard once moved with mechanical certainty and now hesitated. An H in his sleep that was not bodily but belonged to an H of responsibility. There were nights when he slit himself on a quill and the ink that blood matched, in his wary imagination, the deep black lines of the pages. He rubbed his palm and the smear followed him into the dawn. Muriel once found him at the table at sunrise, head down and leaning on folded arms, the candle stub still burning to a sliver and the chorus at a low whistle in the walls. She laid a hand on his shoulder without words and he did not flinch. In the heat of that contact he felt, for an instant, the ledger's mass shift, as if a small body had pressed against his own. Some entries held clear moral shapes here, some blurred into ambiguity. There were names that turned the chorus into ridicule, men who had in life been cruel toward others, who in their last breath tried the same cruelty at fate. Those voices rose then as a jagged, malicious harmony that left the room shaking. There were other names that made the chorus fold back like a prayer. A tenderness would settle, and in that softness Allard would feel the weight lift. Those nights, he took up soup bowls and inverted their residue into a pyramid and laid a scrap of fabric over them. A small act of penance performed like dusting a shrine. The ledger's influence extended into ritual. The execution itself had always been an orchestrated act of town authority. Now the ritual deepened, and Allard, who had once performed with the kind of quiet one reserves for a tradesman's efficiency, found himself enacting gestures that bore the weight of liturgy. He would touch the ledger before a sentence, place his palm flat on the torn leather, and breathe out names, as if calling them into calculation. The rope would feel rougher then, and the condemned would sometimes try to speak more loudly. The crowd, who had once watched for spectacle, now watched for the subtle alteration in his movement. The magistrate's men, who came to collect fines and to confirm sentences, moved more quickly in his presence, as if the air around Allard contained an old and stubborn guilt. There was a night that shifted the ledger from burden to accusation. A woman accused of poisoning a child stood before the hill while clouds fretted the moon. She refused to bow, and when she spoke her last, when wind reads names. The ledger had been a tool before it became a trap. At first it was a ledger in the most literal sense, calfskin leaves bound by a ruined spine, inkwells sealed with wax, margins scored by a hand that knew the steadiness required of a public duty. Allard had taken to the book the way one takes to an obligation impressed upon the bones. He wrote names, ages, crimes, the last breath's composition, the final arrangement of lips and jaw. He wrote with the same motion as he adjusted rope coils and checked knots, deliberate, systematic, accomplished with an economy of gesture that left room only for the necessities of survival. The ledger was his ledger. It recorded what the law allowed him to extinguish and, in doing so, lent structure to his life. The structure gave way in small increments. The first sign was a line in the margin that did not belong to any scribe shortened or a lard's own tight, ruled hand. A curl of ink, like the suggestion of a vowel, as the cottage's wind lifted a page and the candle guttered. The next was easier to deny, a page that lay open the morning after a hanging, the ink dampened by condensation, letters blurred as if by tears. He told himself the cottage breathed oddly at dusk, that humidity and the old stone conspired to lift the paper. He accounted for everything by means of habit. He rubbed his thumb along the ledger's edge. He checked the cord that hung from his apron. He recited, in the careful order of his mind, the tasks to be completed before dusk. That recitation was itself a ritual that postponed panic. Then the ledger began to respond. It did not speak aloud in any human cadence. It offered cadence as the wind chose it. It arranged syllables in the timber of rafters and on the skin of the cottage, and a lard who knew the spool of rope and the weight of a head at twilight, knew the difference between ordinary weather and a wind that had been taught names. The chorus, if a sound could be a thing with intent, came in layers, not unlike the wash of voices in a chapel. It folded accusation into longing and whim into command. Sometimes the sound was a thin, insectile repetition of a name. Sometimes it rose and became a swell like the bell of a distant monastery. Even when the syllables were unintelligible, they claimed the state of being final. They implied closure in their very insistence. Mariel, young and watchful, noticed first as a witness rather than as believer. She had come to learn the trade out of necessity. The executioner's work in their valley was a trade like any other. There were payments in grain and in cloth. There were taxes and lists of those to be struck from the town's memory. Apprenticeship was pragmatica, a lard's appointment practical. She kept the quills, prepared the ink, closed the ledger with care. She was not a woman likely to be swayed by superstition. Whatever voices the wind thrust into the rafters were the province of weather and the creaking of age. Yet she, too, was forced to acknowledge the ledger's new property. She watched as ink, smeared fingertips, traced letters that had not been there when she left the cottage after nightfall. She felt a current lift a page and saw where, in the half-light, a face would press through the paper as if the material were a veil. The shape of a mouth, a blur of cheek, the suggestion of breath. Her reaction was a small thing. She would set the quill down, tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and turn the page with the reverence afforded to fragile things. Allard's mercy was measured not by sympathy, but by obligation. He had held the heads of men and women, had arranged their collars and steadied their shoulders. He had never spoken to them in any way that would ease his responsibility. Mercy, in his hands, was the efficiency of a rope. Yet the ledger reconfigured mercy into memory and memory into a chorus that required listening. His nights lengthened. Where they had once been measured by tasks completed, ropes checked. Ledger closed, they now expanded into the hours he remained awake. Fingers hovering over the page as if the next entry were a hinge unlocking the past. He paused at the margin not to avoid writing, but because the ledger seemed to ask a question in the way the wind rearranged the candlelight. The songs were not songs in the way a human mouth might make song. They were oral palimpsests, a throat's resonance, a scrape of a nail-down wood, the pattern of breath as it left the lungs of someone who had been struck down. They were the sound of endings. The house would lean into them and creak in sympathy. The chandelier's metal would answer with a sympathetic tremor. Even the hearth seemed to do its part, cuffing embers as if to punctuate a phrase. At first, Allard attempted containment. He doubled the seals on the ledger's bindings. He moved the book to a chest and locked the chest, with the key that hung from his belt. He fed the hearth with dry wood and drew thick curtains against the rain. He engaged in the rituals of the practical man. When the chorus pressed harder, when the wind seemed to know the cadence of his breathing, he altered his routine. He read the ledgers aloud, not to summon, but to mark what had already been recorded. The voice he used was the same deep tone that he would use to announce a sentence at the gallows flat, measured, without entreaty. That voice had been shaped by years of telling finalities to the condemned and to the town. Now it failed him. What it could not do was still the wind's insistence. The ledger's entries multiplied in a way uncorrelated to the town's hangings. Names were written that had never been recorded as part of any legal sentence. Sometimes the ink produced dates far older than any living memory. Sometimes the cloth in the margins bore smudges of a dark, iron-like stain that no ink could claim. The patterns in the book were not random. They were a taxonomy of endings. Each entry had a residue of detail, how the mouth had been arranged as if to ward off a particular thought, what the hands had been doing at the final moment, the presence of a token or talisman. Such details could not be produced by a hand untrusted in anatomy and human failure. They were too precise. Within the town, rumor evolved in the manner of infectious things. People tend to seek a rationale, and in a place that punished publicly and often. The idea of an executioner haunted by the voices of the condemned was both irresistible and useful. They had always attributed to the executioner an aura of otherness. He was a function of law and also a border. That the ledger bridged this boundary disturbed the comfortable. Some villagers thought the ledger an object of penance, and sought a lard's counsel as if he could extract forgiveness. Others treated him as if any further contact might bring the same fate as those whose names were written there. The effect on a lard's body was gradual. Where before his breath had been an instrument of sustained labor, now it found small catches and hesitations. He began to rub his temple more often, as if to knead out a memory that had lodged there. The hollowing around his eyes deepened until his face resembled the ledger itself, faded ink on pale skin. He slept in fragments, waking to the sensation of pages turning even when the book lay closed and sealed. In those wakings the chorus was most insistent. Its layers unfurled, pressed against him with the intimacy of a pressed palm. Mariel would find him in the morning at the ledger, ink on his fingertips in patterns that matched no letter he had ever known. Mariel's pragmatism proved adaptive. She maintained the inventory of rope and the tally of those to be judged. She kept the ledger's edges clean when she could, and when she could not, she read. Reading had always been a tool for her. If the ledger refused to be mere record, then understanding its logic might afford them both leverage. Her attention to detail allowed her to notice cyclical patterns in the entries and in the chorus visitations. The sound rose like surf on nights before a ritual was to be performed. It receded when rain pressed heavy on the valley. Most odd, the chorus tended to choose names that had been written last, as if it favored the ajar pages of memory. There was an economy to this haunting. It spared some names and tormented others. Sometimes it offered gentle repetition of a phrase like a prayer, sometimes it forced recollection into a fierce litany. When Mariel read through a section of the ledger and noted the repetition of particular tokens roses, a particular pattern of stitching, she began to map the book in the way one maps disease. She sketched on scrap paper the correspondence between token and sound, between the intensity of a storm and the density of the chorus. She drew arrows and brackets with the same care she had once used to tally payments and harvests. A pattern emerged: certain kinds of endings, those where the condemned offered a final prayer, those where someone resisted to the last, those where a child was involved carried heavier harmonics. The ledger, it seemed, did not simply preserve names, it prioritized their emotional weight. Duty furnished its own cold solution. Allard's instinct was to amend his behavior to the ledger's promptings. If the chorus demanded attention, he would offer it by cataloguing with more rigor. If the wind lifted a page to reveal a name, he would write the circumstances of the death with greater precision. He attempted a form of reciprocal labor. His recording might be the only tether that allowed these last words to hold their shape. The more methodically he wrote, the clearer the chorus became on the nights when the wind pushed through the cottage. It was as if the ledger welcomed precision and responded in kind. Yet there is a threshold where the compulsion of duty becomes complicity. The ledger did not merely replay the past, it pressed the present into the same forms. As Allard fed it detail, the chorus grew confident. It introduced harmonics that resembled command, suggestions as to how a name should be honored or punished. It was dangerous to imagine that the book directed action. A darker alternative presented itself, that by transcribing, Allard completed a circuit and permitted the ledger an extension into the living. Those who had died could be given voice, and voice has a power akin to pressure. The household became a place of constant balancing. Allard learned to stagger his work, to avoid writing more than 2 entries in a single sitting because larger sections, once finished, invited a fuller chorus. Mariel, seeing this, timed her small tasks, mending a rope, sharpening a blade, baking bread around the ledger's moods. The days acquired a new choreography, the morning's chorus, the afternoon's silence, the evening's watch. Visitors learned to speak softly on the threshold. Their footsteps were timed so as not to disturb the fragile business of record and remembrance. Even the children of the town, who once pressed faces against the cottage window to watch the rope's knots be tested, found their curiosity attenuated by a hush that felt like a social law. One evening, a woman from the North Valley came with a parcel wrapped in linen and a sweet voice. She left it on the table without entering the room. The parcel contained a small, beaded charm and a note that begged the ledger for gentleness. She said nothing of the ledger's music. She would not have known how to describe it beyond asking for care where she feared there had been cruelty. People arrived thus, with tokens and requests. Sometimes they offered gratitude by way of defense, giving thanks as if the ledger's attention could be persuaded by an offering. Sometimes they sought to lay guilt at Allard's feet, to accuse him of complicity for listening at all. He received both charity and blame with the same bowed head. It suited him to be a receptacle. The executioner was used to receiving the weight of other people's final judgments. There were more direct encounters. A shepherd, stubborn and coarse, stormed in one damp afternoon demanding to know if his brother's name would be written in such a way that the chorus would spare them both. He flung a half-moon of leather on the table and spat that the very idea of a book that sang the dead was an outrage. Allard told him only what he knew, that the ledger recorded, that it had begun to record more than it should, that the sounds were not for the living to control. The shepherd left unsatisfied and muttering, but later that week he came back with 2 candles and a prayer said badly. Pragmatism, in the valley, was porous. Superstition seeped through where daily life was thin. Allard considered more active measures. He laid the ledger upon the hearth one winter noon and watched the edges blacken as if the book hesitated at what might be its undoing. He thought of fastening the pages with iron strips, of wrapping the volume in oilskin and sinking it under the pond. Each idea carried with it a risk not easily measured. Burning might scatter the music into the air and create a rain of names that no ear could distinguish. Iron might contain it, but harden its insistence. Submerging might drown sound, but give it a new, sullen rhythm. He tried the ledger in the chest again, this time buried beneath sacks of grain. The chorus, meanwhile, only tightened its harmonics, as if tightened skin yields a clearer sound. Whether containment aggravated or mollified the ledger's behavior was uncertain. The book had an intelligence that did not yield to experiments conducted without consent. There was a night when Allard considered silence itself. He thought of refusing to write any more entries, of breaking the agreed practice, and declaring the ledger null. He weighed this as one weighs a sickle along a throat. The act itself might free them or doom them. To stop writing was to allow the ledger to continue its work unchecked by the shaping hand of record. It might grow untamed, a tide of names that the town could not weather. He could not accept that. He returned, weakened and resolute, to the desk and placed a fresh quill in his fingers. The choice felt less like moral clarity than like an acceptance that some structures, once in place, outlive the men who first built them. One dusk, as the gallows cast a long bar across the ground and the valley exhaled a brittle cold, the chorus rose with a persistence that altered the air. It came as a single note and then unknotted itself into many. The ledger lay open. The candlelight softened the edges of the letters until they lived in the boundary between ink and skin. Mariel stood by the doorway and watched the executioner as he placed his thumb to a margin and hesitated. For the first time since apprenticeship began, she saw his hands tremble. The tremor was not caused by the weight of rope nor by the memory of a throat's last resounding cough. It was an old tremor, the kind that forms where a man has carried too many names and made of them a load that wears through the shoulder. He braced himself against a table, then returned to the ledger with a steadiness that was an effort of will. He wrote. The wind pressed harder and the chorus sang. The house listened and became part of the chorus's inevitability. The rafters shuddered in time. Loose nails answered with sharp notes. And embers rose like small stars and were swallowed. That night the ledger revealed a name Allard had never recorded, and then, without the malice of an accusing deity, placed against it the detail of a child's small mitten. The image lodged. The chorus swelled and took its tone like a bell rung in an empty chapel. Mariel felt the urge to close the book, by any means, and yet knew that closing it might be to invite a different cruelty. There was no easy act left to them. Burning the ledger might scatter its music into the sky. Sealing it beneath stone might trap the sound and change its shape into something stranger. To ignore the ledger was to allow it to claim the rhythms of sleep and waking. In the weeks that followed, the division between seeing the ledger as duty and seeing it as contagion hardened. The town, for all its superstition, found ways to adapt. Some sought the executioner at dusk, offering candles and wrapped tokens, as if to buy a gentler harmonics for their dead. Others left their doors bolted and counted their living, as if that alone could ward off the chorus. Mariel kept a tally of visits and gifts. Sometimes they were trifles bred, a cloth, sometimes they were items of greater meaning, an embroidered prayer cloth, a toy bearing a child's name. Mariel's mapping grew more elaborate. She began to index the pages with numbers invisible to most eyes, a code of her own that described cadence and intensity. Where the ledger's margin showed a smudge shaped like a rose, she noted whether the chorus that night had been a low hum or a serried recitation. She kept a small journal hidden beneath the ledger's chest, and when the ledger learned to sing, the ledger kept its silence until the wind learned the proper keys. Allard had never believed in prayers. He believed in ritual, a sequence of motions practiced until the body no longer needed the mind to recall them. Each motion was an argument against surprise. He rose before dawn, while the world outside his cottage still belonged to fog and that long, slow breath the earth takes before it wakes. The heavy leather book waited, its cover softened by years of hands and blotches, its spine bowed where quills had scored and ink had soaked into grain. He set it on the table in the place the candlelight always found first, and he placed his thumb on the edge of the page in the way he had been taught, as if anchoring the world itself to paper. Duty had the tone of a command and the texture of rope. It held him fast. The town called him necessary, and old women spat in street corners and called him careful names. The magistrate presented him with lists like the winter brought lists of debts and frost. He kept names. He recorded last words. That had been his trade. and the ledger was his ledger. He believed in its purpose with the cold certainty of someone whose hands had tied knots to end things that could not be ended any other way. The ledger's authority had not been carved in a day. Apprenticeship had taught Allard the small things, how to trim a quill so a stroke would bow like an eyebrow, how to mix lampblack with water so ink did not run into the grain, how to fold a page to make the sound when the book closed feel respectful and final. He had watched an elderly keeper his master worship the routine as if it were a kind of prayer. There had been stories, too, murmured over Allard the ledger could hold a life as a jar holds winter. There had been warnings, too. Old hands once said that certain words, when recorded, had a way of wanting to be heard again. Allard had nodded, then practiced his motions until the nod became habit and the warning dropped to the floor of his mind like a coin no one bothered to pick up. The first time the voices came, they were only a suggestion, a half-formed consonant riding the curtains of the draft. The leaves of the songbook, dry at the edges, answered with a susurration like a throat clearing. Mariel, who had been sweeping the hearth soot into a neat pile, looked up. Her hands were small and quicker. Her work had the economy of someone who understood that small things saved greater burdens. She had learned to move as if not to disturb the ledger, fingers mindful of ink and the weight of names. She watched Allard, but did not say his name. Restraint had been the first lesson in her apprenticeship, how to stand in the presence of the thing that made people cry, and not make it worse by pitying them. At first, the sound joined the ordinary noises that circled the cottage, the pop of wax, the wind scratching the eaves, the distant clip of a cart wheel on a stone lane. Then it parted into syllables. The syllables were not words in the ordinary sense. They arrived weighted with the geometry of endings, a consonant tilted like a stone against a slope, a vowel loosened and falling. They sounded as though spoken into a well and returned with the space around them intact. The chorus had no face. It was the sum of the last noises people made when a rope tightened and breath became something to be counted. The ledger contained them, and the wind had learned to read. Allard did not flinch. He set quill to paper and let his hand move, as though the ritual would stave off whatever order the world sought to tear free. He had catalogued laughter, confession, accusation, blasphemy, prayer. He had written curses that would be flung like stones and blessings that fell as the softest scraps of bread. The book had been a ledger in law and a reliquary in practice. It was supposed to hold the final burden for others. He had always imagined this keeping as mercy. If the last words were preserved, perhaps they could not gain purchase on him. That calculation had failed the moment the pages began to sing. The chorus did not sing as the living sing. It layered. Voices pressed and slid over one another like worn coins in a pouch. They were patient, like weather. When the wind lifted a page, the voices swelled into a chord built of accusation and confession. Sometimes they were tender. Sometimes they shredded patience into sharp, edged light. They repeated names with the insistence of insects around a lantern, not to call but to fix. They were the sound of someone setting pins in a board until the pattern was all that remained. Mariel watched the pages move as though a hand turned them. She felt the hair along her arms rise, and the way memory could remember pain before the mind understood it. She had come to witness only, to learn the craft and the quiet of closing a life with shape and measure. She had not signed up to be a listener. She knelt and touched a corner of the ledger, and the paper chilled beneath her finger. Ink blood like old rivers through the fibers. She smelled iron and tar and the faint perfume of soap that did not belong to this room. The chorus responded to her touch with something almost like curiosity, as if the ledger had become a door and she had put her hand on the jamb. The nights repeated themselves in the cottage. Each evening the same candle burned and flung the same half-shadows, and each night the chorus learned more of the house's geometry. It found the rafters and hung there like a curtain. It discovered the small iron pendant on Allard's chest and sang around the metal with voices that sounded like coins being rubbed raw. It mapped the spaces between his ribs, the place where his breath had become a habit. When it swelled, Allard would stop his hand over the page and listen, as if listening could measure what was coming. Memory, when left to a man like Allard, did not fade, it calcified. Names did not go staler, they crystallized into a kind of architecture. He placed the names in the book to preserve something else, the order of ending. The rituals were not only for the dead. They were reinforcement for a community that needed its violence anchored to reason. He had never mistaken the ledger for atonement. But he had come to rely on it as one relies on a scaffold. He feared what would happen if the ledger ever loosened its hold. The chorus changed the ledger with time. It taught the pages to remember themselves beyond ink. A breath across a margin might bring a voice that did not belong in the book, a timbre that carried the edge of another town's dialect. Those intrusions were the first portent that the ledger's custody was faltering. Names appeared in the margins that Allard did not recall writing. A date that should have been last summer appeared with smudged numerals from some winter before Allard had been called to the hill. Each new addition came like an apology written in a hand that was not the executioner's. Sometimes the book replayed a sentence from a life he had thought he had ordered properly, and added something afterward. An afterthought that read like a complaint, "Why did you keep me here?" Mariel began to notice the pattern of arrival. The chorus favored certain pages at certain hours, returning with a slow insistence that was almost ritual. It chose voices that had once belonged to children and older men, to those who had spoken of being wronged, and those who had surrendered names as a last offering. The ledger's chorus preferred those with unfinished cadence, and left them to harmonize until the sound resolved into a single, etching tone. The sound had the quality of an accusation that could not be dismissed by clean hands and proper record-keeping. It asked for more than being written. It asked for being heard. Allard's nightly inventory became an exercise in endurance. He recorded and re-recorded names, aligning them in a catalogue that tried to impose arithmetic on chaos. He would line a page and set a quill to the first stroke, searching for a firmness in the handwriting, as if that could hold the voices out. Sometimes, when the candle guttered low, he found the ink looked as though it had been pressed into the page by someone else's will. He had the habit of suspecting trickery. His world required a culprit. But there were no craftsman's marks, no small nails pushed under the binding, no sign of a hand except the one that had always been his. The ledger confessed nothing. It only sang outside. The town moved in its small culminations. People married and died and held grudges across decades. The magistrate, a man who understood how things should be kept tidy, grew anxious. The magistrate's sleep grew thin. Orders that had been obeyed for years altered subtly, as though the ledger's chorus had threaded the rules with a different rhythm. A sentence once carried out with legal flourish now arrived with the taste of glare. The news remained the same, the knot itself a piece of precise craft, but the way the condemned turned their heads now carried a deliberate clarity. Citizens began to remember things they had thought forgotten. Old grievances surfaced like submerged wood, and the ledger seemed to lubricate their rise. Allard noticed that the chorus's insistence was not random cruelty. It had a pattern of preference. It loved unfinished things. A man who had died while apologizing. A woman who had been silenced mid-prayer. A child whose last breath was a laugh. These notes the chorus pressed to the fore. They were the raw edges of a life that wanted completion. The ledger, which was meant to bottle endings, had become an instrument that amplified seams. Mariel said nothing of what she suspected, but she acted differently. She began to fold pages the way one folds cloth, smoothing edges that wanted to curl. She took to humming while she rubbed and inked, a small human attempt to overlay the spectral chorus with something ordinary. The act was an offering to habit, an insistence that a human noise might steady the other sound. The voices learned certain things about the house. They found the place behind the hearth where a draught made a whistling of its own and used that notch to speak more clearly. They discovered the exact bend in the slats where the sun found the ledger at noon and warmed the paper into the scent of old skin. On a night of high wind, the chorus accomplished something that looked like organization. Individual voices separated and formed a leading line that Allard thought of with private alarm as melody. It was not melody in the sense of pleasantness. It was order. It marched across the pages like ants across a map, recognizing paths where there had been none. One entry pierced further than the others. It is dangerous to insist upon a single name in a chorus, because a chorus resists hierarchy. Yet one page swelled with intensity and refused to let the others crowd it out. The voice that emerged from that margin was less a voice than a clarity. It had a texture like dried rope. It recited a name and then added the detail of a place. The place was not in Allard's ledger, a small town on the other side of a river where he had never been called to work. The chorus insisted that the ledger had always contained that name. The book's paper showed the faintest indentation where a quill could have been. Allard compared handwriting until his sight blurred. He found no match. The town noticed when the ledger's habits altered the surface of life. People came with petitions that had always been answered with the same grim courtesy. Some came to ask for names to be redacted, for old confessions to be erased from official memory. Others came to demand that the book be opened and read aloud in Market Square, as if public display could dilute the intensity of a name. Allard refused. Ritual, to him, required privacy and a specific order. He had been taught that endings required a place where the living could step away and not be tempted to rearrange the facts. They could not be treated like laundry. The townsfolk grumbled but stayed away from the cottage at night because even the bravest did not want to hear names return from where they had been buried. There were practical consequences to the singing. The magistrate who had once insisted on the ledger's inviolability grew restless. He visited the cottage and, after a moment of touch, the gesture of a man who trusted the feel of leather more than his own judgment, took the book into his hands and then put it down as if it had burned. He pressed a palm to the book's binding and then to his own forehead. He had once demanded certainties and now avoided them like cesspools. The legal rhythms of the town shifted. A sentence once carried out with legal flourish now arrived gleaned with a stare that suggested the condemned were more than listings, more than entries. The people began to look at Allard differently, not only as the man who performed an ugly necessity, but as the steward of something that might overturn their careful arrangements. The chorus had other abilities. It could mimic the cadence of people who still lived. It could pull from the ledger a phrase that belonged to a daughter and let it hang in the air until someone in the town remembered to visit a grave. It could make a widow find the last letter she'd hidden in a trunk. Small cruelties turned into necessary redemptions. The ledger's new agency reorganized the social geometry, grudges adjusted. Alibis collapsed. Old confessions returned with more color than before. People began to suspect that memory itself had been tampered with not by malice, but by an insistence that things be completed. The town confronted this change with the mixture of superstition and practicality that always carried a village forward, hands scrubbed, stains, arguments rekindled. A widow went to a trunk, a son found a letter. One night the wind came in a winterish temper, a rawness that stripped the candle smoke from the air. The pages flipped by themselves and stopped on a leaf where the ink had long since dried. The chorus gathered and Allard heard, within the multi-layered sound, the faint outline of an imperative. He moved forward with a quill shaking between his fingers and pressed down a line in an attempt to hold whatever wanted to spill through. The ink bled under pressure and left a smear that looked almost deliberate, as if the paper itself had protested. He felt the ledger under his hand like a living ribcage. Mariel had positioned herself across from him, a single pool of quiet. There was a new steadiness to her face, as if the apprenticeship had forced her features into a map of expectations, how to cut a page, how to seal a fold, how to let a name rest. But tonight her eyes had changed. They measured risk where once they only learned restraint. She watched Allard not with pity, but with an evolving calculation. She had seen what the ledger could do to a town. She had begun to imagine what it might do to a man if it learned to prefer one keeper over another. If it chose not merely whose words to remember, but whose hands would write them next. The night widened around them. The chorus thinned and then swelled, like breath exercised in preparation. They were on the edge of something the size of a decision. The book, which had once been a repository of endings under human control, was becoming a transmitter. It took from each last word an instrument and tuned it. The ledger's singing demanded an answer: to listen, to resist, to rebind. Allard understood in a way that had nothing to do with propriety. He knew the ledger could no longer be managed as he'd always done. Ritual had to be adapted when the world offered new notes. His choices were few. He could destroy the book and risk letting loose whatever was inside it. He could present it to the magistrate and watch the town dissolve into a chorus of its own making. He could try to learn what the chorus wanted, treat it as a mourner rather than a tormentor, console the dead until the voices found rest. Each option felt like loosening a knot. Each promised consequences. The old arguments returned. The ledger's custodianship was a form of power. Power could be misused. Ignorance could be lethal. He thought of the rope, of its clean geometry, and the kindness of a quick end, and understood that a rope and a ledger both had edges. The final image of the night was of the ledger lying open on the table, a single flame shaking and pitching as if some invisible hand attempted to snuff it. The song continued, not pleading now but making precise requests. It did not ask for justice, for that would be too simple. It wanted to be repeated exactly, to have its phrasing entrenched in the world, as though a second utterance could solidify a life that had been wrenched when pages became choir. On the slope of the gallows hill the day folded itself into a particular color of exhaustion, the sky bruised between blue and iron, and the sunset took on the look of dried blood pressed thin. Allard moved with the economy of a man whose work had removed any taste for flourish. He kept the ledger at his hip like a sacrament and a shackle. The book was heavy with names and the salt of old ink. It had become, across years, the exact center of his days, and the slow fracture within them. He had begun as ritual. The town provided a rope and a sentency. He provided the method by which law turned into finality. In the immediate hours, after a sentence, he would stand with the condemned, not to pronounce mercy, but to listen with the practiced calm of his profession. Names and last words were not always a tidy thing. Some left curses, others begged the favor of God in language softened by fever and dirt. Many spoke in the same thin, resigned voice of people who had long ago practiced the surrender that death required. For Allard, the ledger had been a ledger only, a necessary account. Each entry was a line on a roll call that placed him within an order: execution, tally, ink. That order made things tolerable. The ledger preserved names. The preservation gave his life a shape. In the years since he first bound the book, he had recorded 300 final utterances. The number itself wore on him like a count of obligations. 300 was not an abstract figure, it was a chorus of endings. The binding had gathered a kind of pressure. On windless nights the book lay inert, a parish register of small deaths. But when the wind visited the cottage and the pages lifted, a pattern had arrived that he could no longer explain away. Pages that had seemed to bear only the weight of ink began to answer the night. When the wind read names, it did not do so in the neat, audible way of a human voice. It was subtler. The ventriloquy of air through leaf and page made syllables where none had been intended, and the cadence was never the same twice. Allard first noticed it as a repetition, a dying breath that seemed to return, elongated and folded across the room, pressing against the curtains. At first he imagined his memory, the mind is a treacherous witness and memory will refuse to stay dead. But as the nights multiplied, the sound took on a texture like a chorus warming itself in the throat of the house. It was layered, an impossible number of small voices stitched into one sound that rose and receded like a physical tide. Mariel took to watching him in these hours, troubled by a compassion she could not name. She had come to the cottage for a trade and for food, to learn the practice and to take its wages. In the apprenticeship she found both the practical, how to knot and bind, how to maintain heavy rope, how to set the method to the condition of a man so that the town could call it lawful, and the inexplicable, the book that sang. She watched him with the soft terror of someone learning the walls of a terrible room by touch. When the wind lifted a clustering of pages, she would move to the hearth and fold her hands as if she could press the cottage back into ordinary light. Allard did not journal his inner life. He kept accounts that could be counted by others and rituals that could be inspected. Between the practicalities of execution and the solitude of the cottage, his remorse was a private, calibrated thing. It had rules. His remorse was expressed in habit. He always washed his hands with the same coarse soap and dried them on the same towel. He rested his thumb along the ledger's edge before taking a quill. He would not sleep with the ledger on the bedside table. The ritual made the guilt legible and therefore contained. Routine was his way of putting the world into a box and closing it. The chorus had no such respect for boxes. It arrived by atmospheres. A draft rolled under the door, a page shivered as though startled, the candlelight leaned and sliced. The voices swirled through the cottage as if the very wood had been a resonant chamber. They did not speak in names so much as in the tonalities of the last breaths, the thin patterns of confession and accusation. They wore the smell of damp straw and the metallic tang of old blood. The sound shivered in the corners of his hearing and pushed at the parts of him that had, until then, been preserved by practice. This chapter in the ledger's life, when the pages became choir, was not a single revelation, but a series of small escalations. At first it was only noticing a line of ink that seemed darker, a blot that looked like a thumbprint pressed in haste. Then memory started to bleed into the present in a way Allard had not expected. He would be writing, and the quill would pause as his hand felt, with perfect and unwanted vividness. The weight of a body at the gallows, or the way a condemned pair of eyes had fixed on the sky. He had believed his mind had grown colossus. Instead, those colossus were splitting. The townsfolk talked, as townsfolk will, of superstition and of curses. They told stories at the market about the executioner who had stopped sleeping. They offered remedies they thought suited to superstition, charms, a prayer, the donation of a candle to a saint. None of those things touched the problem, because the problem was not something that could be negotiated with a market's bargain. The ledger did not want remedy. It wanted to be read. It wanted to be heard. Mariel, practical as she was, tried to catalogue how the phenomenon worked. She watched the cottage on windless afternoons, and then on days when the breeze came up with the smell of the river. She noted which pages flipped when the storm clouds gathered and which names seemed to cause an answering swell in the air. She saw that the chorus favored certain papist pages, whose ink had been smeared in haste, whose lines carried the tremble of hands that were either from cold or from fear. The voice was choosy, and the choice seemed to be rooted in more than mere ink. When a page turned of its own accord, and the candlelight found the words, the sound rippled through the room, like a memory finding its echo. Those pages held small markers of life, a blot where the quill had hesitated over a mother's name, a margin note where someone had scratched a child's age in the corner, a hurried line that ran into a blot where the rain must have fallen on the paper the day it was written. Mariel began copying these marks into a separate book of her own, a list that had nothing to do with sentencing and everything to do with texture. She recorded the way letters leaned as if exhausted, the halting of syllables where breath must have held. The more she wrote, the more she understood that the ledger recorded not only who had been taken, but how each had arrived at that small, final sound. Allard began to change the order of his work in small, stubborn ways. He rewrote names when a particular phrasing prickled him. He would not let a page remain crumpled. He bathed the ledger in careful attention as if neatness could be a kind of armor. In the evenings he sat at the table under the low lamp and read aloud to himself, not to hear his own voice, so much as to set a human cadence against that of the house. The spoken pacing did not stop the wind from calling back, sometimes it seemed to invite it. That only made the music more personal. The voices were once the voices of the town. They were now a chorus anchored to him by the work he had done and the ink he had laid down. He found, on slow afternoons when the river muttered beyond the hedge, that some names resisted his neatness. There were those written in haste by a hand that trembled from cold or anger, penned by a woman's careful looping script. Those scrawled in a child's sloppy rush by a clerk called to witness. Each carried its own shade. A thief with a loose jaw and a quick laugh. A man who had killed in the heat of an argument, but had kept his hands clean afterward. A woman whose fingers had learned to mend linen with the same patient motion she had used to stitch a mental map of the town. They lived in the ledger as a strain of vocal timber. When the wind found one of these pages, the house answered in a color of sound that was impossible to reduce. Once, in a night of wind so violent it pulled at the cottage shutters, Allard found himself with the ledger open on his knees and the pages moving like the wings of a trapped bird. The candle flames bent away from their wicks and threw the room into a dozen shadowed planes. The chorus rose, close and layered, and Allard felt an animal panic at the center of his body. He tried to shut the book. The leather resisted. Some force in the cottage kept it open as if the pages were being read by an invisible hand. He thought of the Tawley. 300 entries. He thought of the rope and the geography of Gallows Hill, how each sentence had been carried up that slope, how the nooses had darkened the skyline in winter like a geometry of final shapes. He thought of the faces he had seen and of the ways some of those faces had looked back at him without the illusion of hatred, only a sort of resolute, patient surprise that memory had its own cruelty. It was not the accused who had inflicted it, it felt, as though the ledger itself had learned how to demand a listener. In the days that followed, Allard tried to impose new rituals. He attempted to rebury names. He tried tearing out pages and burning them in the hearth. Each torn name left a rawness in him that no small flame could absolve. The smoke carried the memory of the ink into the rafters, and if anything, made the chorus more insistent. Burning did not silence the ledger. It taught the book new timbres. The ash tasted like ledger, sung grief. Every effort at obliteration only altered the music. A charred edge made the wind's syllables crackler, a stitched page added a bass line of tension. Allard would sit afterward, blackened fingers tucked beneath his sleeve, and feel the cottage vibrate with a grief he had not thought possible. He began to keep small offerings by the hearth, not of superstition, but of economy: a clean cloth, a cup of cold water, a tight knot of rope. These acts felt like tending a wound rather than closing it to her. They were gestures that acknowledged rather than erased. Mariel came to him with a thin braid of resolve. She wanted to bind the book differently, to stitch a new cover and to set seals of wax across the spine. She worked with stubborn, amateur skill at the table as the candle watched and the cottage held its breath. She did not propose prayer or banishment. She offered the practical, to create a cover that would not let the wind find purchase, to make of the book a device again, an object that measured rather than answered. She also, privately, wanted to know whether the ledger could be read with a different temperament, whether memory, when given a new container, might recompose itself into something less sinewy. The new binding was heavy. They worked through several nights. Each stitch was a performance of thread through vellum, wax pressed and smoothed. The candles burned low, and the organ in the background was as if the walls themselves hummed with an undertone of ritual. When the new cover was finally fitted, they closed the book and said nothing. Language felt insufficient. The ledger was no longer just theirs. It was a thing that bore the weight of the condemned. At first the cover seemed to help. The pages did not flutter as easily. The wind, deprived of an immediate inlet, made lesser sounds that curled about the eaves. Allard slept for the first time in many weeks, with a measure of release. But the ledger's hunger found another route. One afternoon, when the light slanted cold through the shutters and the hearth had not yet been lit, a single corner of a page slipped free at the spine, unnoticed at first by both apprentice and master. A slat of sunlight found the exposed words, and the house answered. The chorus did not require an open book so much as it required a place to gather that would let names be called. There was a night that changed the balance between duty and tradition. A storm pushed over the river, white in its force, and the wind came as if to claim the hill. The gallows board shivered in the distant frame of the town like a low continuity of sound. The cottage was a grotto of lamplight and damp wood. The ledger, newly bound, lay sealed and close on the table. Mariel slept under a blanket on the rushes. Allard sat awake, hands folded, feeling the ledger's mass like an accusation under his knees. The composition of the chorus that night was different. Instead of the layered smallness of many voices, there were harmonics that expanded, deep undertones that made the floor sing under his weight. He rose and moved to the table without deciding. The pull was not cognitive so much as bodily. He opened the book, and a silence, perfect and cold, filled the room. The wind stilled as if in waiting. Then, from the margin of the page, a sound like a single thread uncoiling ran through the cottage and into him. The chant was not of any language he knew. It was the quality of last things, the compression of a life into a syllable. His knees weakened. He wanted to close the book and stand by the door instead. He found himself reading names into the air with a voice that trembled less from fear than from recognition. It was as if, in that moment, the ledger had given him an alternative to mere containment. The chorus was not simply accusation. It proposed memory. It offered the possibility that each name carried not only the weight of the act performed, but the shape of a life that had been obedient to its own small story until the day it collided with law. Some names brought a hush that was not pity, but the sound of a bowl settling into place. Others pushed like waves and left him reeling as though he had been struck. Afterward there was no tidy fix. Tradition had been the architecture of his life. Duty was the program that ran it. Now both were altered. The ledger had not been eradicated of its hunger. It had, instead, made Allard a conduit. The cottage kept the music like a magnet keeps filings. People in the town noticed that the executioner's eyes looked older and more reflective, that he paused more often at thresholds, as if waiting to listen before stepping across them. Mariel became the vigilant observer, a witness to the change in him, and to the way the house allowed the dead to be present in the small mechanics of day, a plate left unwashed, a broom that trembled on its own where no one brushed it. There remained, underneath everything, the ethical calculus of his work. Duty could not be renounced without consequence. The law demanded that sentences be carried out and that the executioner do his part. Allard accepted this every time he placed the coil of rope on his arm and walked up the hill. Yet the ledger had pressed open a painful corollary. To record was to be responsible not only for the act, but also for the manner of remembering that followed. The ledger's chorus forced him to consider what it meant to preserve the end of a life. Preservation had seemed a virtuous thing, a way to keep names from falling into nothing. Preservation had now become an active voice that judged him by the fidelity with which he had held each page. At the heart of the ledger's power was a cruel poetry, names that had been read as tally now required a listener. The wind offered him that role with the insistence of a bell. Whether it was a kindness or a cruelty depended on which side of the table one sat. For Allard, who had once believed that ritual and distance could steal him, the chorus had been a quiet, unstoppable dismantling. For Mariel, who watched him with the mixture of empathy and fear that comes to younger witnesses, it was the test of whether the human heart could remain functional when pressed by the weight of so many remembered endings. Their life found new practical patterns. Allard began, before each execution, to whisper the names he would record afterward, as if briefing the book and the wind that might listen. He paced differently at the gallows, taking a glance at the sky that suggested an unseen conversation between the townspeople's gossip and the fifth turn of the ledger. By the time the ledger reached its 500th page, the town had learned to keep its doors latched when the wind came down off the hills. People told one another the sound that came through the shutters was merely the old cottage settling, a house remembering the seasons, and for a while that explanation sufficed. Because small towns abide explanatory economies that spare them the trouble of confronting what they do not want to see. Those who had been present at the executions, those who had watched the rope eat the light from a man's face, and then looked away with a fever in their throats, knew another story. They remembered the precise rasp of the hemp, the way the gallows beam came alive under hands that had learned a careful violence. And they had learned, too, the ledger's peculiar agency, Allard's pen scratching across paper, like bone against stone, his thumb resting on the leather edge before ink dried, and the way the pages answered when the wind moved through the shutters. Allard moved through his days with the same predictable rhythms that had governed him since he first accepted the office. Dawn was for preparation, the measuring and splicing of rope, the coiling of nooses kept away from curious fingers. Midday for the town's business, the petitions and the passing of sentences. Dusk for the hill, and the work that made his hands both feared and necessary. He attended the gallows as a duty prescribed by custom and law, not as a profession born of malice. The ritual comforted him in the way ritual comforts those who carry burdens no one wishes to shoulder. It created a scaffold beneath a weight. The ledger sustained that ritual. He kept it as one might keep an inventory of tools, names, and confessions penned in columns, brief accounts of the condemned's last words, the weather that claimed them, the time when breath left the body. Order preserved the world, ink made sense of chaos. The ledger itself was an object of slow accretion. Thick vellum took the ink as old skin takes scars, gathering stories into a palimpsest of cruelty and care. The cover was leather-worn to a matte sheen, its corners darkened where hands had sought anchor in moments of fatigue or decision. It carried the smell of iron and candle smoke and the faint, chemical tang of ink ground over years. Allard kept it under his arm like a talisman and worse like a record. His hand wrote without flourish. He was a clerk of endings who both recorded and ratified the city's acts. He wrote names as if binding them to history and to his practice, as if a script could secure the town's narratives against erosion. The act of recording was also an act of service. That, at least, was the story he told himself, the architecture of his conscience. Mariel had apprenticed to him out of necessity and curiosity. She had come to the cottage young and grim, faced her palms soon marked by rope, burn and ink, learning to make the rope's eye, to tend the tar on the gallows beams, to wipe down the iron ring that clicked shut upon the cell doors. She learned, too, the peculiar choreography of the ledger work, how to hand the pen when Allard's hand trembled, when the night pulled at the edge of his steadiness. She watched Allard more than she watched the condemned. She listened to the ledger more than to any sermon. Where the town watched spectacle, Mariel watched the records. She studied the ledger's margins and the small, habitual signs in Alada's posture, the way he touched the pendant at his throat when a name spoiled his handwriting, the way his brow furrowed as if listening to a distant argument only he could hear. She felt, in the muscles at the base of her own neck, a shared tension that taught her when to look away and when to lean in. In the beginning the wind had been a nuisance, an annoyance that flipped a page and smeared a fresh signature. The cottage's shutters rattled, a candle guttered, the dog in the yard whined. Then, as the ledger filled and its vellum gathered hundreds of last words, the wind tuned itself to the ledger's timbre. A gust would comb the pages and a sound would rise, a susurration that was neither one voice nor many, an articulation of breath falling in and out with a cadence that suggested sentences where there were none. The chorus did not speak plainly. It layered accusations and pleas, names and dates repeated until the syllables became a texture rather than a message. At first Alad blamed fatigue, or perhaps an over-imagination warmed by image and repetition. A man's brain, he said in the dark, will make patterns from noise. That explanation held only so long as the ledger lay quiet. People who have seen the aftermath of execution come to possess a certain kind of memory, a jar of landscape between breaths, the metallic taste of blood in the air, the reversed arc of silence after a body falls. Alad's memories, unlike those of most men, were catalogued in his book. Each entry was a tilt toward permanence. The bailiff's daughter who had whispered a confession of theft before the noose took her, her words folded into a line of small, exact script. The midwife accused of witchcraft who had whispered a prayer as frost edged the row pass. The soldier who spat curses, and the names of men he regretted having followed, each voice lodged in the vellum as if roots had taken hold. The ledger lapidified those moments into entries as solid as bonus. When he turned a page, he felt the past pressed through, a layering that had weight. The chorus grew in a way that defied any neat, rational arc. It did not arrive suddenly, but accumulated like rot at the heart of old timber, slow, inexorable, and at first unremarkable until it made the whole structure smell. At first it only touched the edges of night, a fragment of verse half remembered, a vowel that trailed like a moth. Soon the texture thickened. When wind met page, whole cadences rose. A name repeated in chorus not as a single intoned syllable, but as many harmonics converging to form a single sound bearing the weight of multiple griefs. Where Alad had once been master of the room, pen poised, ledger open, ritual secure, he became an instrument tuned by something beyond him. The more he wrote, the more certain he felt that the ledger's contents demanded to be known. Mariel began to hear it too. It started with the small things, a sense that the room had shifted, a smell of damp earth that had no source, a thin cold across her neck that made her fingers atch with a phantom rope burn. She explained nothing aloud. She simply placed her palm over the ledger and felt the faint tremor of pages like a pulse. Her training made her careful. She learned to turn pages as if touching a sleeping animal, slow and deliberate, mindful of the way pressure altered the delicate response the book gave to being handled. Doing so, she noticed how the chorus changed in tone according to where the book lay. Near the margin of an old entry, it folded into something like apology. Beside a fresh confession, it became urgent, a serrated insistence that would not be quieted. There were nights when Alad tried to resist. He fasted, drank bitter tea that burned his throat, shut the shutters and bolted them with 2 leaden bars and a chain. He wrapped the ledger in coarse cloth, sewed a simple dowel across the binding, and sank an iron nail through the leather as if to pin it shut. In the morning he would find the nail loosened, the dowel sitting on the floor as if pushed down from within. The cloth vibrated with the chorus, and the pages lay on the table with a single leaf lifted a fraction, turning its face to gather the air. Once he weighed the book beneath a sack of grain and slept in uncomfortable watchfulness. At dawn he found the seam of the sack eased, and the topmost vellum marked with a damp, ring as if some breath had been released through it. The ledger would not be simply restrained. Allard's practice of recording had always involved choices. Some confessions he summarized, some he left whole. Official accounts required brevity, and certain words were struck through in a hurried spatter when expediency demanded it. Those struck through lines became the most persistent. The act of erasure seemed to vex the chorus, which fed on the half-remembered, the denied, the wounded syllable. The ledger had become an archive of both what the town had seen and what it had chosen to forget. The chorus wanted wholeness. It wanted the denied syllables reconstituted into a body of speech. For a book that had been kept for the tidy administration of justice, this demand was a kind of insurgency. The townsfolk spoke of the ledger in tones that mixed superstition and practical interest. The magistrate, a man of ledgered mind in more ways than one, recognized with a bureaucrat's calm that Allard's book was the city's memory and, as such, a form of control. He proposed rules, indexes, the insertion of dates in uniform hands, the small ministrations that make power appear neutral. The clergy, who might have condemned the book entirely, found themselves pausing. Confession and absolution had long been instruments of structure in their hands too. And theological neatness resisted taking a hard line against an artifact that revealed sins otherwise swept aside. Instead of denunciation, they offered ritualized distance, an acknowledgement that some artifacts resist tidy ecclesiastical categorization. Only the children's games betrayed the truth of the placet. They would run past the executioner's cottage at dusk and dare one another to press a palm to the door. They smothered giggles and then ran, carrying with them an inexplicable shiver as if it were a contagious secret. Allard's hand tightened the ledger's spine, as if compressing the voices within. He began to insert small notations, a cross in a margin where a prayer had been offered, a slanted mark to indicate the presence of fear, a double stroke for those who insisted on a name as their last breath. The more notation he made, the more elaborate the chorus became. It rearranged itself in ways that suggested intention. Phrases echoed across pages, names overlapping the way memory smudges the edges of an image. Sometimes Mariel saw the ledger's letters shift when the light struck the vellum letters, seemed to lift, an inked word raising as if a body rising. Once she watched, almost with amusement, and then with alarm, as a struck, through name blood faintly into the gutter like a bruise pressed through skin. The ritual that governed his work eventually slipped. Allard found himself writing at odd hours, waking with ink still drying on his fingertips, the scent of lamp smoke in his hair. He spent mornings rehearsing steps that might keep his hands from trembling on the hill. He kept rituals because ritual was armor. Yet armor, however thick, does not repel a tide of small voices. The chorus would swell and recede like a shoreline pushing salt into the house's bones. Allard rationed his sleep and lied to himself. It was because the book demanded updates, because his hand was steadier when he was exhausted. The mind thinned of other thoughts could better commit the contours of a confession to paper, he told himself, until he began to wonder who was serving whom. There came a night when the wind arrived in stages, a slow indecisive breath at first, then a hard shearing that made the candle flame bend away as if in warning. The shutters clattered to, dust moved in lazy luminous eddies that the candlelight made visible like ghost moths. Allard, who had grown used to the ledger's intrusion into the private, sat with his back to the hearth and let the candle light the page. Mariel was at the table's far end, hands folded over a stub of chalk, watching the way the ledger's shadow stretched like a man turned inside out. The chorus rose like a swell. It named the dead in an order that was not chronological, but seemed to be assembling a pattern. The book's page lifted, one delicate leaf floating as if cupped, and a sound issued from the paper, not human articulation so much as a chorus of lungs singing in a darkened room. That night the chorus did not plead, it spoke with the bluntness of recurrence. It rendered the ledger's contents as a litany of edges, the quick pen strokes left by way of mercy, the names smudged by rain on a gallows day. The times when the town had declared justice and the body had been something else entirely. Voices overlapped and braided until an impression formed a map of harm. It was as if the ledger had folded the entire history of the hill and a shopkeeper's brawl and a priest's laziness into a single geography of consequence. Allard felt his chest both loosen and tighten, like bellows inhaling then clenching. The record he had kept to administer law now administered a reckoning of its own. Muriel watched his face. She watched the slow retraction of composure into something hollow and new. Where once his ritual steadied him, now it exposed him to an accumulation no ritual could contain. The ledger's singing ceased to be merely intrusive. It became insistent on being listened to, not for the sake of truth alone, but for the sake of being acknowledged. It asked to be named and repeated until the town could no longer pretend it had been anything other than a place where certain hands were permitted to take what others had been denied. They tried small experiments at first. Allard would write a name, then leave the book closed for a week, sealing it under a sack of grain, soaking it in brine, burying it beneath a sheepskin, each attempt a superstition in the language of trying to outwit a thing that was at once material and uncanny. The chorus found ways to speak through even that dampened shield, a wet tapping, as if the names were trying to swim, a slow decay of sound that felt like a tide with teeth. On other nights Muriel read aloud from the ledger, not to give voice but to offer an offering of order when she read. The chorus quieted, and then rearranged its pitch. It did not want mere recitation. It wanted the texture of being remembered in the way memory remembers, not as a list, but as a presence, full of relational knots and resentments. As winter crept toward the town, the ledger's songs grew colder. The chorus scent grew metallic, like frost on an old blade, and the book's voice acquired a brittle edge. Allard found that he could predict which pages would be most vocal when the east wind came. Those were the entries where the dead had died with words unspent, with names they refused to relinquish. He began to notice small anomalies in the script, tiny flourishes where none belonged, an ink blot that suggested a finger had been dragged across a letter. Once, upon close inspection by lamplight, he found a fresh mark where no hand had been. It curved into a margin like the beginning of a name. The discovery was like finding a body in the cellar. It made the house feel less like a shelter and more like an evidence room. The town's governance began to shift around him. The magistrate proposed a register to standardize records, a civic archive to bring all individual ledgers under a single roof and under an indexer's hand, arguing that a single repository would prevent superstition and allow for efficient adjudication. The clergy muttered in corners about propriety and the dangers of keeping such unblessed artifacts. For a moment it seemed that the ledger's danger might be a problem formulation could solve. Allard bristled at the idea of surrendering his record to a cabinet of officials who would file, fold, and disinfect the living corners of memory. The ledger had grown into his custody, it had also grown around him. To hand it over would feel like handing over a body. That custody demanded a decision. The chorus, which had once been background noise, became precise. It supplied alignments of names that suggested relationships, patterns of cruelty that traversed generations. It named traitors and those who had been loyal to bad men, those whose small sins had propagated larger harms. It offered not absolution, but accumulation. The ledger would continue to sing as long as the world kept producing endings for its pages. The choice facing Allard was not whether to continue recording. Habit and law had decided that for him. The real choice was whether to record differently, to annotate differently, to refuse certain conventions, to let silence sometimes take precedence over duty. In the end, Allard's gesture was not a burning nor a smashing. It was quieter and therefore more terrible in its intimacy. He took a fine needle and, in a place of long, exacted order, began to stitch. He sat with lamp and all and linen thread, because there is a kind of prayer in slow work, a deliberation, that is also a deciding. He ran the thread through the spine, through the long seams between gatherings, and with each stitch he tied names together. He sewed the ledger into patterns that refused its earlier claim to mere chronology. He linked pages that had once been separated by distance of years, threaded the name of a shopkeeper beneath the line of a thief, braided a child struck through confession into the entry of a juryman. The stitches, the 6-turn ledger of wind and duty. The wind that pushed through the casement the night of the 6th turn arrived without ceremony, a thin, honest thing that found every weakness in shutter and seam. Allard had learned to read the weather the way a man learns to read a ledger, by the small betrayals, by how a single draft could make a penned name smear or a candle gutter. He stood in the little work room at the back of his cottage while the dusk thickened into a greasy dusk of rain clouds and distant lamps. The news over the hill would not be used again before winter, the town magistrate having stilled the wheels of accusation for the season. But the rituals in the cottage continued regardless of civic business. The ledger demanded its keeping. For 27 years the book had made its home at his elbow. He called it duty. He called its entries records. In his bones, in the places most men carry simple trades, the ledger had become a religion, thin, hard-edged, covered in ink. Each evening Allard opened it with the same thumb-firm touch, watched the parchment sigh, and encountered a last line laid down by a hand that, minutes or months ago, had surrendered or fought or prayed. The naming was exacting, the copying ritual precise, the condemned as last words, as they had given them or as the wind of memory allowed. It was this meticulous order that kept Allard from collapsing into that other thing his ancestors had spoken of quietly while sharpening their knives, pity so deep it unstitched a man. Mariel watched him work at first from the doorway and later from the stool opposite, her small hands folded in her lap, the stub of chalk at her belt. She had learned the motions, the ink pot's angle, the song of the quill across vellum. She had learned to stop her breath at the right moments and not to look too long at the faces that appeared when Allard lifted the candle to peer along an entry. She was young enough to think apprenticeship would be a sequence of tasks and payments, practical and finite. It was older things, the habit of listening, the toll of memory, that tugged at her attention like a dark hem. She watched when the ledger spoke most loudly. There was a reverence to the listening that sometimes made Allard look like a man holding communion. From the 4th chapter of this record the pages had altered in temperament. When pages became choir, she had written in the margin once, in simple chalk after a fitful night, and the phrase had stuck. The 5th turn had been quieter outwardly, but sharp, below the surface. The 5th turn of the ledger revealed a night, when Allard nearly closed the book forever. Fingers trembling, the ink pool refusing to be still. He had not closed it. He could not. The book remembered better than he did. Or perhaps it forced him to remember what he had tried to set aside. The 6th turn arrived not as revelation but as continuation. The cottage smelled of damp wool and candle tallow. The hearth had been banked. But the candlelight still splayed its yellow badges across the table, pale smears of glow that made the ledger's edges look like landings for moths. When the wind came it moved as if seeking permission, and Allard lifted his chin. The ledger lay open to a page that had been started weeks ago and left to dry, a name, a city, a scratch of prayer. His thumb hovered because the ritual required presence, not haste. He placed the nib in the same soft curve he had used for 300 names and began to roll the ink into letters. The chorus came on a note not of violence but of layering faint, as if a dozen lips had leaned toward one another and learned to breathe in the same rhythm. At first it was nothing more than a suggestion at the edge of hearing, the sort of thing that could be dismissed as rafters settling or a night owl's cry. The sound drew a line along Allard's spine, making his stiff neck lock the way an old door locks under wind. Mariel looked up and then down again, careful and abrupt, as if recognizing the gravity of an old instrument being tuned. The ledger's page answered before Allard wrote the last stroke. It was not speech, the page did not speak words aloud. But the ink scratch, the feather's pause, the candle's small motion, all of it found purchase in the air and braided into sound. The chorus rose and fell with the draught, a litany of syllables that could be a prayer or a bittering. It moved through registers so that a voice might begin low enough to be a child's whimper and end with a soprano keening the precise consonant of a city's name. They did not demand in the way of the living, they repeated, layered, and when the weather shifted their tones adjusted like tide. Allard's hand did not stop. Allard's work was always his hand, and the hand is often a stronger man than the heart. He kept the script small and certain. He copied confessions and curses with the same stroke, because the ledger was impartial. The hand that strangled and the hand that stole bread were equal on the vellum. This impartiality was a bulwark, a wall he had set between himself and the guilt, a wall he revisited nightly, measuring its mortar by the degree of his own trembling. On the sixth night, the chorus took interest in a single entry and bent a voice toward that liner, a woman from a northern hamlet, accused of witchcraft for knowing herbs, a thief who had stolen to feed a sister, a soldier who had trembled before the execution block. The voices overlapped, repeating the syllables of names and places until they became a pattern, an incantation. They were not content to be mere sound. They folded into the grain of the paper and seemed to lift the ink a fraction, like breath under a shroud. Mariel reached across and touched the corner of the page where the voices pooled. The paper was cool and smelled of smoke. The law of their town held that to remember a person was to bind them. Allard had never believed that he was binding the dead. He had believed he was saving them from being lost to official erasure. Yet each new night taught him that moving a pen on vellum had consequences beyond the court's ledger. The act of writing was a claim. The chorus existed on memory and wanted to be held. That wanting could be gentle, it could be accusatory. Sometimes it wrenched like a tide toward confession. When one voice swelled with pleading at the same time, another seethed with accusation. Allard felt as if a courtroom of cold breath sat in his room and judged him for choices he had made in obedience to orders. The sixth turn moved through ritual, the tucking of hair, the lighting of the small candle placed at the ledger's spine, the scraping of quill against the ink-stained lip. The cadence was steady, the gestures practiced to the point of being automatic. Allard did not sing. He listened, and his listening was an action. It was the practice that had kept his hands from shaking enough to smear a name beyond legibility. Mariel learned the cadence as though it were a lullaby, but unlike lullabies it had no future promise. The rhythm promised only more names. An hour into the night, a gust forced the cottage's shutters to rattle like teeth. The candle flamed and spun. The chorus responded as if delighted syllables arsing into melody, pressing around Allard's head so close that he felt their cold on his ear. They began to knit repetitions of an old ritual, words that sounded pre-Christian and human in the same breath, a tally, a listing. Remember folded into 3 notes and repeated until Mariel's mouth shaped it without meaning to. The sound did something to the room's scale, stretching it until the ceiling softened and the hearth seemed far down the hall. Memory reoriented the places. The simple cottage became the hollowed center of a much larger stage, where towns and fields and gallows rose like models in fog. Allard paused then. Not from surprise, but from that heavy human recognition that comes when a man perceives a consequence of his craftsmanship he did not foresee. The ledger had been a ledger. Now it acted as an amplifier, an instrument with a tongue. The chorus wanted names repeated. The chorus wanted the ledger sync to be turned into music. It wanted, perhaps, to be known in a way that was more than archival. Allard could have closed the book. He did not. The depth of duty held stronger than the quiet terror he felt in seeing the dead find voice. A memory unreeled behind Allard's eyes, not his own, but one of the ledger's many. He saw a man on the hill with a child's hand in his, a rope over his shoulder as if it were a tool and not a fate. He saw the young too, proud magistrate pronouncing words whose meaning would weigh down a body. He saw a girl's mouth form a request for absolution, the prayer muttered with the same haste as a thief's plea. These were not visions conjured by witchcraft, not active phantasms, they were compendia of recollection the ledger summoned when the chorus pressed. Allard kept copying. He had to, because stopping would be an act of betrayal to the ledger's own logic, transcription as continuation, preservation as service. As the night wore on, other memories surfaced, each brief as a coin flipped and caught in the cold. There was the woman from the northern hamlet whose hands had been stained with the making of bread and with the bruises of herbs. Her accusation had been as much a geography of neighbors' fear as any proof. There was the thief who had taken a loaf with shaking fingers while a baby, fever-sick, lay in its mother's ragbed. His theft had been recorded not as malice, but as arithmetic empty larder, a sister's cough, a knife pressed to a throat by hunger. The soldier, who had no quarrel with courage but trembled in the face of a clean death, had recited a list of places he had failed to save and benedictions he could not live up to. Each recollection arrived in a different timbre, and each asked for nothing so much as the ledger's fidelity. The chorus changed timbre now and then, slipping between accusation and fatigue. It was possible to hear amusement, as when a distant wind toys with empty cups. It was possible to hear blame laid at Allard's feet, a slow, almost tender modulation that implied both remember, and you are part of this. The voices did not ask for redemption, they required a witness. This requirement was a type of hunger, and the ledger fed it with ink. Allard had always thought that he recorded the final words to provide closure for the living. He now understood the closure belonged to the dead themselves, a last insistence that someone write them down and thereby maintain them in a shape that could be revisited. There were nights when the chorus was kind. There were nights when it called for vengeance. This night grew complicated. A voice braided a lullaby with a list. A claimant, perhaps, the thief wanted the ledger to remember the reason behind the theft, to mark the small, forgotten kindnesses that preceded the crime, a neighbor who left a pail of water, a woman who wrapped bread crusts in used cloth, a priest who once looked the other way. Another, perhaps the soldier, wanted to lay blame on the magistrate, whose orders had been a lever more than a judgment. The overlapping demands created a texture like braid rope, a supple binding. Mariel's apprenticeship had taught her to measure ink and to tape vellum to a drying board. It had not taught her to hold a room's moral gravity. She felt it now as a pressure at the base of the skull, a coldness that spread like spoil from a broken jar. Her eyes found Allard's, and in them she saw not the man who had taught her to tie knots and mend rope, but a man whose face had been divided by responsibility into a knowing and a forgetting. There was tenderness for the dead in him, and also a methodicalness that had made others call him monstrous in private. The ledger turned those possibilities into equal, adjacent facts. She thought of the first time she had arrived, damp and eager, bearing a loaf of bread from her mother and a pair of old scissors. He had told her then, plainly, that the work would take a certain fraying from within, that the more faithfully she wrote, the more the stories would press in on her. "You will not keep everyone," he had said, "but if you keep them poorly, you will not keep any." There had been a hardness to him that night, a resoluteness folded into a gentleness that now lay like a seam along his mouth. She had practiced letter forms until her hands ached. She had learned to hold a quill as one holds a living thing, knowing the pressure that would not drown the ink and the pause that would let a name breathe. She had not expected to learn how to receive accusation without flinching. The sixth turn reached a small crisis near midnight. A page with a child's scrawler name and a last drawing of a bird refused to settle under the quill. The hatch of the child's handwriting had been quick, clumsy, full of the kind of hope that children put into marks. The ink pooled in a way that suggested a letter's completion would lift the drawing into a tone the chorus needed. Allard made the gesture. He wrote the last stroke with hands that carried the weight of every strung name. The sound that issued from the page afterward was not a single voice but a chorus of the town's unnoticed laundresses who had watched from their windows, cartmen who had kept quiet while laws were enforced, a preacher who had once hesitated when offered a bribe. The sound remade a neighborhood of small gestures into testimony. The ledger snipped the moment of death from private histories and turned it into a public refrain. Allard thought then of scales and balances, of the magistrate's ledger of taxes kept across the square. That book was utilitarian, meant to be read and acted upon. It made the town run. His own book, he reminded himself, did not require a hand to move its marks, it required a hand to witness. The magistrate's ledger counted obligations and made rules. The ledger at his elbow counted nothing that could be spent, but it kept an accounting the town owed its dead. It asked for a different economy, the economy of attention. When the candle finally bowed to its wick and threw a shadow the size of a cave across the table, Allard closed the ledger with a soft, resolute slap. The chorus did not vanish. It settled like moths rounding a light, circling, patient. Outside, the wind lost its cruelty, as if the night was satisfied with having been given an account. There was a terrible sweetness in that satisfaction, the taste of a memory that is both relief and accusation. Allard set the ledger back into its leather strap and secured the iron key on its thong. He moved with the small, habitual gestures of a man who has given up expecting absolution. The key was cold in his palm. Its metal had the familiar notch worn smooth by finger and night. Mariel stood to fetch the shutters but paused in the doorway, hand on the latch. She looked at the ledger where it lay closed and then at Allard, whose profile the guttering candle washed in worn umber. For an instant she saw the ledger less as object and more as altar, and saw Allard similarly transfigured, not merely a keeper, but a conduit for a history that refused to end. They extinguished the candle in silence. The chorus lingered at the window like a prelude, a collection of refrains that rose and fell as ordinary as breath. When the shutters thudded shut, the sound felt like a final page turn. There would be a morning where the town went about its trade. A magistrate would rid his ledger of taxes and a child would learn to tie shoes. But in between those small human motions lay the ledger's work, persistent and patient. It reminded them that the past keeps an accounting, and that to write is to continue the dead's insistence on being known. The sixth turn did not resolve anything. It reshaped the cottage's interior life, recentering the ledger's hold and clarifying the chorus' expectations. Allard slept badly that night, as men with heavy consciences doka dreams of rope and overcrowded markets, of names flaring on a page like iron. He dreamed of the rope over the hill as a pendulum that did not swing but watched, patient as a clock. He dreamed of a crowd that did not jeer but waited with folded hands. Mariel sat by the hearth until dawn, rubbing at a blot of ink on her thumb until the skin reddened. She thought of small things that had been swallowed by the night, a child's mitten left on a step, a woman who had given a last crust to a dog, the seventh turn when pages sang. The ledger lay open on the long table beneath the single guttering candle, as if it had been waiting for the seventh turn. Allard's thumb rested against the worn leather edge out of habit. The gesture had become a ritual reflex, an anchor in a life measured by names and dates. Outside, the cart track that led to the gallows still held the rhymed dust of many footsteps. Inside, the cottage smelled of damp straw, cold iron and candle wax, the same small inventory of scents that had stood between duty and collapse for a lifetime. On evenings when the wind came off the hollow, The house took on the rhythm of its own history. Pages rasped like distant bones. The thin shutter groaned in a cadence that matched the lath of a lard's pulse. For years the sound had been an annoyance, a small insistence that the ledger required attention. Lately the insistence had a shape, a swell of voice behind the pages, a layering of consonants and breath that gathered into harmonies as impossible as they were persistent. He told himself it was fatigue, or the multiplying memory of words uttered under stress and rope. Naming it did not make it go away. The ledger itself was a heavy thing, its leather stained in places where ink had bled and elsewhere where darker marks had soaked into the hide. Some stains were old as memory, others were as fresh as the scars on his hand. Each entry carried the same dense economy, a name, a charge, a fragment that the condemned had delivered before the rope took their breath. Many entries were short and clerical, a curt indictment of fate, a plea for God, a cursory notation of age and trade. Others ran longer, strings of confession and curse, of oaths taken and bitter reckonings. The book felt heavier each time he closed it, as if the paper stored not just ink but weight. Mariel learned the ledger like one learns the inked contours of a map. She had been apprenticed to a lard for 2 seasons and a string of winters. She watched him approach the table, watched the way his shoulders rounded with the same wary precision, whether he had turned 1 page or 20. Her fingertips, ink smudged from copying, hovered over margins that smelled faintly of iron. She could not pretend curiosity did not mix with calculation. To know the ledger was to hold a kind of leverage in a profession where one could be replaced by a stranger by morning. She learned to keep questions quiet, to catalogue inquiries by tone rather than by directness, and to read when her presence soothed and when it tore. The 7th turn of the ledger arrived like another dusk. Allard had performed the usual hours at the hill, the knot, the measurement, the placing, and the formalities that kept the town's order. He moved through the mechanics of legal death as a man moves through a familiar storm, hands steady even when the heart is not. When he returned, the wind had shifted and the cottage door found him with a push that made the candle flare. He set the ledger down and did nothing at first but listen. There is a particular attention that one gives to a house one has made a workplacer, the way floorboards answer steps, the way shadows collect. He allowed himself that small, professional pause. The wind carried voices that were not wind. They threaded into the rafters and pooled along the table. They were not coherent as a single tongue, they overlapped in dispute and lullaby. Sometimes they repeated the same syllable like a litany. Sometimes they layered last names upon trades, detail upon detail that stitched into each other until the sound formed a chorus of unfinished sentences. The effect was less a possession than a claim. The chorus did not plead for release. It seemed to ask only to be held on paper, to be measured and kept, and in doing so to assert itself against the silence that had been their final companion. Allard's hand moved as if by muscle memory, as if ink and feather were the longitude and latitude of a landscape he didn't choose to question. His quill scratched a line beneath a name, the motion precise enough to cut the air. The sound was sharp in the layered quiet. The ledger answered, a gust shifted the margins, and a dozen tiny voices harmonized on the consonant at the end of the line. Mariel watched the way his jaw clenched, how the eyes that townsfolk called hollowed by sleeplessness narrowed until the steel, grey iris became a bizzle of ice. There was no sudden agony. There was the slow accretion of pressure, the way an old wound weeps when the weather turns. The chorus never spoke singly. Its nature was a palimpsest, a high, accusing whisper flitting across the edge of a lower, more lugubrious tenor. A child's breath joining a man's curse in the space of a beat. Sometimes the quality of a voice was so like the breath of a child that Mariel's hands tightened on the ledger with instinctive protectiveness. They moved like mist, curling when the candle drew and thinning when the draught died. The physical world did not accommodate them easily. They left no footprints on the table, no residue on the leather. Their proof was the ledger's reaction and the tremor in Allard's fingers when the quill came down hard. He had never been a man of superstition in the way others were. He did not talk to saints nor curse openly the workings of fate. He believed in ritual. The rope had taught him that life could be measured by weight and length, that a duty performed in the right order resulted in the right outcome. The ledger was an extension of that belief, names recorded, lines drawn, a taxonomy of endings that made the chaos administrable. But the ledger had become more than ledger. It was now a surface upon which memory bled back into the world, on which the final words of others gathered like smoke and shaped themselves into sound. Mariel kept a calibrated distance that allowed her to act when necessary and to withdraw when the strains deepened into something beyond sorrow. She watched how the candlelight pooled along the grooves of the table, how the shadow of the coil of rope lay like a darker echo of the book. Sometime mid-turn she moved to set another candle to keep the paper from damp and the room from growing too intimate with night. In doing so, she discovered how the chorus swelled not merely in voice, but with a visual suggestion. Figures, first only evanescent blurs at the edges of sight, gained edges in the flux of flame and dark. They did not become solid. They were, as the ledger described them, mist-like silhouettes, clothing the shapes of memory, features that dissolved at the edges. Yet they arranged themselves in the corners of the room in configurations that suggested procession. Sometimes they stood as if waiting their turn. Sometimes they pressed against the near wall with the posture of those who have been cued for punishment. The presence had choreography, an ordering of the dead by rank or grievance, a pattern that complemented Allard's devotion to order and terrified him for it. He had always preferred his dead to be tidy. These were not tidy. There was a moment, the sort of moment that marks an axis in a life, when the ledger flipped one page of its own accord. The wind had been light. No visible gust had breached the panes, yet the paper turned. The candle flame leaned and the scent of damp straw sharpened, a metallic tang threading beneath it. The chorus rose with the turn like a tide, and for the first time their combined quality produced an identifiable interval, a fragment of last words repeated and refracted until it became a melody. A small architecture of despair and defiance that fit neither category easily. Allard's mouth moved in the small, private gestures of one attempting to match a pattern. He did not sing, he charted. He underlined a syllable and traced a line of marginalia with the careful temper of a man who had learned that certain things must be attended to with the steadiness of a baker's hand. The act of writing anchored the sound and seemed to give it purpose. In the ledger, lines that had been mere marks again took on the weight of law. The chorus responded not with gratitude, but with an intensity that felt like accusation, their harmonies knitted into something both plaintive and doctrinal. The more precise his notes, the more elaborate their harmonies became. The ledger and the voices engaged in a bleak reciprocity. Mariel's hands trembled when she touched a page. Her training in the trades had taught her posture and measurement, not how to withstand being examined by a chorus of last breaths. She experienced a compulsion to count to verify that the ledger's entries matched the music that arose. Counting is a practical defense. It organizes the world and pushes back against the flood of unmeasured feeling. She counted names in a column and found her fingers pressing ink into the grain of the paper until the texture registered beneath her nail. Numbers did not grant comfort. They granted focus, and in that focus she found a small dignity. The chorus, in its layered speech, began to press into memory details the ledger had never recorded, small offenses and private mercies, gestures of love hidden beneath the coarse cloth of the condemned. A fisherman touched a child's facetious, a quarrel ended with an apology, never taken back, or a woman smoothed a husband's brow before a rise of sore courage. For each new detail the ledger recorded an annotation, scratches that were at once clerical and ceremonial. The book did not simply receive these additions. It reflected them with a tenacity that made Allard flinch. It was as if once fed, the pages refused to be sated. Outside, the gallows grove sighed as if in sympathy. The rope coil hanging above the hearth cast a spider of shadow across the floorboards like the print of a hand. Allard's scarred hand paused mid-line. He had worn that leather apron through 1,000 seasons. He had seen men reduced to silence and refused to believe that anything could follow. But belief is a brittle thing. Repetition wears at certainty. Under the new pressure of voices, the ledger's gravity became a question rather than an answer. The sequence that unfolded over the 7th turn was not cinematic in the sense of a single thunderclap. It was a crude compound, a tide that came by degrees. There were small disruptions that, when left unchecked, reached a pitch candles gutted out without wind. The ridge of his thumb, the place where the scar caught the light, pulsed with a pressure like a headache behind the iris. Mariel found an annotation she had not written and recognized in the margin the shorthand of a grief she had not yet owned. These were not dramatic revelations so much as a slow, inexorable revealing, like a fog thinning to reveal a ruin. In one such anomaly, the ledger recorded a name that did not belong to the town's roll, a stranger's name, folded into a line and marked with a cross that seemed older than the crossing. The ink was darker than the others, as if the book had opened to receive it from a different hand and then closed with intent. When Allard traced the stroke, his finger left a ghost mark on the leather, as if he had touched frost. The chorus swelled into a cadence that suggested recognition rather than demand, an emphasis that made Mariel look away. The visual manifestation accompanied the acoustic pressure. The mist-like silhouettes edged closer, their clothing sometimes an echo of the trades they had been, sometimes only the ragged suggestion of a shroud. One figure loomed at the corner of the hearth, taking a stance neither threatening nor supplicant but demanding to be seen. Its face was a shifting mask. When Mariel tried to fix it with a look, her vision watered with the strain of trying to hold what would not hold a gaze. There is a cruelty in a thing that insists on being acknowledged and refuses the consolation of closure. Allard did something he had never done before. He closed the ledger with a force that made dust leap from the pages. The sound was decisive. It had the bluntness of a carried-out sentence. For a moment the room held its breath. The candlelight rattled and then steadied. The chorus quieted to a low hum, less a receding than a waiting that tightened like a brace. He moved the key from the worn thong and let it dangle at his fingers, the metal cold and familiar. It had spent years at his side, a small companion to his rituals. It was a pivot between lock and promise. Mariel perceived the key as a possibility. Mechanically, it belonged to locks and doors. Symbolically, it belonged to the possibility of closure. Touching the iron felt like touching what could sever the continuing of things. She suggested, without words but with the cadence of hands and head, the course's history allows to bind the book to burneth it, to hand it to the magistrate and let civil law rename the uncanny for what it had become. Each option carried punishment of a different order. There was civic punishment exposure, a trial to decide whether the unnatural should be accounted for, and a metaphysical terror, deny a presence that had found voice and risk setting it loose. There was also the private cost to the keeper of the ledger. To give it up was to give up the knot that had held his life. Allard's fingers tightened on the key until the knuckle whitened. For a sustained interval he allowed himself to imagine the ledger as an object that might be altered in purpose. A single cut, a single toss to flame might end the chorus, or it might set the voices free in a way that would no longer require order to hold them contained. The ledger was both the lock and the prison. He had been both the warden and the recorder. The thought of relinquishing either role carried a vertigo that reached to the marrow. In the end, the decision was not dramatic. It arrived in small increments, the soft heavy of the book back upon the table, Allard standing and finding his cloak. the slow motion toward the door that led to the gallows grove. He wrapped the ledger in oilcloth to protect the binding from weather and carried it with the care one gives a relic or a wound. The chorus rose then, not in protest, but in a swelled register that made the hairs along his forearm stand erect. The harmonies held no malice in the narrow senses. They offered last words as if the ledger were not merely an object, but a vessel in which memory might find purchase again. At the hill, the light toward dusk sat like an accusation. The gallows, skeletal against the lowering sky, cast long bars of shadow across the earth. Around that hollowed clearing the birches stood as if petrified in attendance. Allard seated the ledger upon a flat stone and unwrapped the oilcloth. The pages lifted in the thin breeze as if anticipating the motion they had found within the cottage. For a moment he thought a pattern showed itself, the names aligned not by chronology but by some moral weight, as if the book recognized a scale that no man had taught it. The chorus made a sound like a church bell struck under water. It was at once toll and requiem. He did not set fire to the ledger. He did not hand it to the magistrate. Instead, with movement practiced enough that it might be called prayer by the superstitious, he opened the book and let the wind pass through the pages. The voices filled the space as if called on cue. He read, not loudly but with the kind of attention that makes the eye slow and the breath shallow. The pages turned, the chorus sang, duty and remorse braided into a rhythm that was more commandment than confession. Mariel watched from the tree line in the failing light. She could see the profile of his face, the long, gaunt jaw she had traced with her eye since her apprenticeship, the thin vertical scar like a line of mapped history. She saw his shoulders slope and rise with each breath, as if keeping time with an unseen metronome. The ledger did not simplify the world. It made it denser, and in doing so demanded that someone hold both grief and procedure at once. There is a particular loneliness to being the keeper of a history no one else wants. The seventh turn concluded not as a single revelation, but as an accrual of small, irreversible notes. The ledger remained closed when Allard returned home. The oilcloth wound with a knot that matched the rhythm of the rope coil above the hearth. The chorus retreated to the margins, but left behind a residue of melody that unstitched sleep. In the days that followed, townsfolk noticed a slight change in the executioner's manner and added pause at the threshold of the gallows. A new reluctance to meet certain gazes. He moved with the same measured cadence, but the measures bore notes of something like pleading. He paused more often at the names, lingered with hand on the leather, as if to reassure himself that the page would not. The eighth turn ledger's reckoning. The ledger had weight that behaved like a moral gravity. It answered to the room as if every name fastened a chain within its spine, a thing that pulled at the bones of whoever held it. Allard kept it on the workbench beside the candle well, leather swollen with ink and human residue. Pages gone the color of old bone and faintly sore with the scent of iron. He did not open it quickly. His thumb found the edge as a prayer finds a habit, and for a long breath he listened for the wind in the rafters, for the slow settling of planks, for the soft, particular memory that lifted from paper when a name was turned. There were nights when the ledger lay closed and blessedly mute, and those were the nights when Allard felt time as a thin, merciless thing. Each tick of the hearth clock a reminder that his hands existed to fulfill an ordinance. There were other nights when the wind came like an accusation, and he thought he could hear the thin threading of voices unspool across the room. Duty had a rhythm. Duty thanked him in the only currency it knew, a kind of peace, small and cold. He had kept the ledger because he had been ordered to, because it was his task to collect endings and commit them to ink. The town wanted its rulings witnessed, its terror catalogued. For years he served without question. He read names aloud into the bark of the book and watched Mariel copy the tollies, her pen brisk and certain. This was ritual. This was function. The ledger was a ledger, and he, a man of the rope, was merely its keeper, The shift began with small things. A page would lift at the merest sigh. A candle flame would elongate as if someone else had drawn breath. Shadows along the wall would double where once there had been only one. At first Allard told himself it was the house whose old timber and thin glass made strange music. Later, when a page turned though the windows were latched, and the letters on a line trembled as if a hand had only just lifted a pen, he recorded the change with the same measured hand he used for every other entry and set the quill aside as if the inked sentence might still be warm with a soul's heat. The chorus arrived the way weather arrives in layers that remade the landscape. It did not speak in a single voice. It layered a whisper like moth wings, an off-key humming that threaded into a keening, a recitative of names that resolved into melody on wind, heavy nights. Sometimes the sound was accusation, the cadence sharp and surer. Sometimes it wanted confession, slow and riffling like a hand through hair. Voices overlapped, sutured into harmonics that made Allard's gut convulse with information he could not pass. The ledger answered. Pages would quiver open at a certain line, and the chorus swelled, as if the ink had become a conduit. Mariel watched him from the door more often than she let on. Apprenticeship kept her near to practicalities, sharpen quills, mend cords, prepare salt and oil for the nooses, see that the iron key was oiled and true. But when Allard's fingers trembled and his script staggered and then steadied, she felt the edges of the world shift. She had never known a man who performed justice with more steadiness. He was discipline embodied, a machine of ritual. Yet he also kept his thumb pressed to the ledger before he wrote, as if checking for temperature. He paused to listen when the wind moved. He rubbed his temple when names returned to him. Those repeated small actions became signs, script grammar she could read as clearly as Tully marks. At first Allard tried to translate the chorus into practical terms. The simplest admission he could allow in the quiet hours was that the dead wanted being known. Names were talismans and last words were offerings of regrets, muttered pleas, curses hurled away. He kept them in neat rows. With each entry his life felt more crowded, as if the ledger pulled the past toward him like a net. The net, he told himself, served both the town's appetite for closure and his own search for order in a life carved by necessity. But memory is a volatile material. The ledger took what it desired and returned it with additions. He wrote a last phrase in the clean, efficient hand of an executioner. When he opened the page the next dusk, the phrasing had shifted. Sentences extended, provided clarifications that could not have come from any throat he had seen, as if someone had stitched extra fabric onto a coat. Names repeated in different mouths, dates echoed in chant. The more he read, the less he trusted his pen. Ink blotted and reconstituted into half lines that shimmered between clarity and shape. Mariel confronted him once not with accusation, but with curiosity that was a small, bright beacon. She turned a page gently, careful not to disturb what might be sleeping, and the room filled with a chorus unmapped. She did not scream. She listened with a face that was impressed and frightened in equal measure. Allard's remoteness hardened. He held to rituals the way soldiers hold to drill in the mud. Before an execution he checked the rope, the iron key, the ledger's thickness. He read aloud the name he had written, not as conversation but as procedure. When a condemned soul offered last words, he transcribed with a hand that did not falter, even as ink pooled and bled into paper like a slow, inevitable wound. He did not alter the wording, he did not paraphrase, he transcribed. The ledger, however, did not always accept the transcribed as final. It refined. It rejected flat endings in favor of something broader, a chorus that claimed context for itself, supplied omitted history, asked questions of the keeper. The magistrates had no appetite for metaphysics. To them, the ledger was proof of process, a neat stack of accountability. They met at the appointed hour with wigs and scrolls, and left with orders issued and penalties affirmed. None of them read at night. None of them heard the choir that made the rafters twitch. When Mariel suggested binding the book tighter, Even leaving it closed for a fortnight to see whether silence could be preserved, Allard refused. The ledger was his obligation. To deny it was to deny the one structure that had lent his life shape. In private his refusal faltered. He spent hours with one hand on the book and the other combing his hair, thinking of rope and faces he had watched descend into nothing. The ledger kept names as if retrieval could atone. The singing came for him like weather. At first it was nuisance, a tremor of syllables under the floorboards. Then it became a muscle in the house that flexed against his chest. He dreamed of a choir made of ash, voices that had been cut off but found measure again in air. They sang things that were not quite memory, fragments of laughter that did not belong to the condemned, recollections of hands that had not yet learned mercy. He would bolt upright with the metallic taste of iron on his tongue. It was not so much the sound he feared, but its intent. The chorus wanted something beyond transcription recognition, perhaps, or to be heard in full. It wanted him to transcribe not merely the last words given at the gallows, but every ripple of meaning that lingered on a dying lip. The ledger indicated a crescendo one night, when a page lifted by itself and revealed 3 names in tight succession: an unbalanced farmer, a pickpocket adolescent, and an itinerant accused of speaking against the steward. The town had delivered them to Allard in a week thick with rumor. Each had spoken in ways the book later embroidered, contrition expanded into prophecy. A curse became pleading, a child's misremembered lullaby was elegized into a requiem. When he read the pages by candlelight, the chorus braided the lines and the room filled until the air seemed heavy with other lives. Mariel set the quill down and stood by the door, a witness he had not thought to invite. He felt a tremor run through his long bones and realized that his life had been a ledger entry in a larger account he did not fully comprehend. Something began to change in him. The ledger had always been an instrument of containment, a way to make the explosive succinct. Now it accused him by the manner it expanded. Names that had been mere strokes became compendia of lives. He had believed transcribing last words an act of impartiality, ritualized closure for the living and, perhaps, a courtesy for the dead. The ledger taught him that closure was a lie. Memory was not a tidy sum, it was a spreading stain that could not be swept clean. Allard found himself reading entries he had not written and feeling a hot, private rage that had nothing to do with municipal justice. He thought of the magistrates, their scented hands, their certainties. He thought of the rope in his storeroom, coiled like a sleeping thing. For the first time, duty pressed against his throat. Mariel tried a different measure of fidelity. She spent long hours copying entries into a smaller book she kept hidden beneath her palette, writing in a careful hand that wanted to be accurate. Her reasons were practical and moral. She wanted an archive that would not be amended by whatever force altered the ledger. She wanted to preserve a truth that might be taken from Allard's haunted hands. But the ledger would not be mirrored. When she later opened her own copy to compare, the ink had smudged where certain lines should have been whole. Where she had written a short curse, the ledger rendered it an apology. Where she had noted a plea, the ledger supplied an accusation. Her small book trembled under her palm like something that ached to be right but lacked power to change what the larger book insisted. One evening the wind carried a different quality into the cottage. It smelled of damp clay and wet iron. Candle flames leaned away from the open window, and dust motes traced a slow, hesitant bullet in the lamplight. The ledger lay open and the chorus rose like a tide. Allard stood at the bench and for the first time felt no reservoir of composure. A name halfway down a page glowed with a brightness that felt more memory than ink. The accused was not on the town's roster, the date was wrong, the handwriting looked like his but spoke of a crime he did not remember witnessing. The voices swelled until even the rafters seemed to hum, and for a moment the house itself sounded like a throat clearing. Mariel moved without asking. She reached for the ledger and a cold gust rifled the pages as if the book inhaled. The chorus's harmonics rose into a wordless cry. Allard's hand shot out and pressed his palm to the open leaf. The room spun, not with dizziness but with the sense that two worlds were trying to share a hinge. He felt the ledgers pull a heavy, mournful insistence that names be more than names, that the dead be given fuller lives in the thin scrap of parchment. They wanted to be legible. They wanted witness beyond the rope. He understood then that the book was not merely a repository but a device of communion. He made a choice then, not dramatic but inevitable. He would read them all aloud. He would give the chorus what it wanted, not only the last words he had been given, but the full measure of the lives behind those words, as much as the pages would offer. He lit extra candles. He set Mariel in a chair near the bench, and she closed her eyes to listen, the patient steadiness that had drawn her to apprenticeship. He opened the ledger and began to speak, not as a magistrate pronouncing sentence, but as someone naming each life to make it more true. He read for hours. Names bloomed into histories opened into liturgies. The candle wax dripped like small verdicts. The chorus answered, not always tenderly, some accusing, sometimes laughing, sometimes singing a thin lullaby to which his words provided new rhythm. The room filled with images that had no place in the town's tidy account, faces he had glimpsed in the glare of torchlight. Events that might be the echo of another town's violence, the remembered warmth of a child's hand that the book insisted belonged to a condemned woman decades past. When he faltered, Mariel steadied the page, and the voices murmured not gate-kept, but eager into the margins. The distance between his own memory and what the ledger produced grew, until he felt like a stranger to himself. When the last candle guttered and the house held its breath, Allard closed the ledger with hands that trembled not from weariness, but from the vertigo of having given shape to so many insistences. For the first time in his life, he felt a fracture in the thing he had called duty. He saw that the book had never been merely municipal record. It had been a vessel, an articulate mouth, an altar at which he had been both priest and penitent. Its weight no longer seemed only ledger-like. It was accusation and salvation rolled together. He placed it back upon its shelf and discovered that the chain of his life rope, key, ink had altered in perception. He had been keeping names, yes, but he had also been keeping them small, contained. The ledger had refused containment. At dawn the town's bells rang the same as they always did. Outside, the world resumed its chorus, children swept thresholds, bakers turned loaves, magistrates drank morning wine and paced through their certainties. The chorus thinned with daylight into a memory that was not entirely gone. For a moment the cottage felt ordinary dust motes descended like soft arguments. Mariel sat opposite him and looked at the ledger with quiet that suggested both fear and a new reverence. They had no easy conclusions to offer each other. Both felt the shift as a wound that might mend or might yet deepen. Allard took the rope down from its peg and laid it on the bench beside the ledger. He did not coil it. He smoothed its fibers with fingers that were more curious than repentant, tracing the weave by muscle memory. Duty had been a loop he wore without question. Now it was an item on a table he could touch, examine, perhaps alter. He hesitated. The chorus had given him a ledger swollen with names and intimacies he had not sought. He could return to his task and keep doing what he had always done. He could refuse the addition of these newly voiced details and continue to work as if the past were a simple ledger line. Or he could act on the ledger's insistence, allow names to expand into lives, let the town reckon with the full shape of its punishments. The book did not demand a single legal decision the way magistrates required form. It required witness. Allard had known his duty, he had known his implements. Now he had been given a charge he could not ignore without being untrue to the thing that had become part of him. When he finally walked outside, ledger under his arm and the rope slung but not tightened, he carried the weight of both objects differently. He moved through the market not as a cloak of inevitability, but as a man bearing evidence. People parted for him with practiced fear. Their eyes slid to the ledger at his hip, and then away as if checking whether a rumor could be ignored. He did not look for forgiveness. He only wished the names he had kept to be more than footnotes. Mariel followed at a careful distance. She had her small notebook beneath her smock, and every so often cast a glance toward the ledger's edge, as if to see whether its pages still breathed. The chorus had receded, but had not gone, and an aftertaste of memory remained prickly on their skin. Allard felt, for the first time, less like an executor and more like a chronicler chosen without his consent. He had recorded last words for years, thinking that by doing so he had set things in order. The ledger taught him otherwiser that recording could be an act of mercy if it allowed the dead to be spoken fully, and a cruelty if it reduced them to procedural endings. He would not stop performing his role. The town needed its law, but he would change how he recorded. He would present names so they might be read to other ears. He would make the ledger less an archive locked in a box, and more a testimony shared in market and church. If that required standing before magistrates and demanding that the town consider context, that it listen to the chorus when wind lifted pages, then he would stand. He felt the ledger's insistence as an ethical pressure, akin to the tightness in his hand when he closed a noose around a pleading neck. In both acts he recognized the intimacy of bearing witness and the moral cost of denying the full life behind a single final breath. The wind that day slid through the streets like a thin verdict. The ledger hummed against his ribs as he walked. Behind the